All right, so now for another segment of anthropology that is near and dear to my heart, and that is economic anthropology. This is a very broad discipline that has a long history in anthropology, and that looks very different also now when you're looking at what kind of jobs anthropologists can get. For instance, there's a lot of anthropologists now working in corporate environments that are trying to do market research to try and ascertain the best way to market a new product to individuals or to get people to be able to understand what it looks like on a certain website and navigate the features of that website and how that can be used to, for instance, influence what they're buying also too. So companies like Google and Facebook, etc., are starting to hire actually anthropologists, which also creates some ethical dilemmas as well concerning, okay, if my obligations are to my researchers in terms of the anthropological code of ethics, or if my obligations are for my participants, sorry, then what does that mean when I also have a job and a boss that is telling me I need to find out certain things about these people also too? So contentious topic in anthropology right now internally, and it is debated on what is the role anthropology should take. Should they even work in corporate environments? Really, there's a lot of different ways you can take this, and there's not really one answer, and it depends on really just the individual that's doing the research as well, and their understanding really of ethics in terms of their work. But that really applies to all anthropology at the end of the day, so is it really that different? All right. So, in order to talk about anthropology in terms of economics, we must first define economics. Economics as a discipline focuses primarily on market exchanges, the flows of goods and services, and how decisions interact with the market. To an economist, the market is sort of this amorphous thing that kind of floats around that we all kind of participate in. In a lot of ways, it kind of mirrors how we think about culture, but there are also a lot of underlying assumptions that make it diverge from how anthropologists define culture. For instance, there's underlying assumptions broadly in economics that people know what they want. They are, in a sense, rational actors. If they need food to live, they will buy food. That's basically the underlying assumption. But as we talked about in this class, people oftentimes do not act rationally. And that's one of the biggest critiques anthropology has into concerning economics, is that it kind of sees people as sort of robots or mechanisms in a larger system, and we act in certain ways that can be predicted, which will influence the economy and the market as examples. Exactly. On top of that, there's also the underlying assumption that people buy things they want. And the way to make people to buy things is to make them want to buy those things, right? That makes sense from a market point of view, at least, right? However, again, people may not have the means to buy something, or they may rationalize that, okay, well, this is really costly. Can I buy let's say, a knockoff or an alternative? Or I like milk, but I can't afford milk. I'm going to buy, let's say, water instead. That's just a really base example. That people want to buy things, but they may not have the agency really to buy what they want. And also, sometimes people don't really know what they want, or what they want may be unattainable for them for a variety of different reasons. However, one thing that anthropologists probably would agree on, in principle at least, is wants are determined by their economic status and culture. Again, your environment, your culture also too, which are tied together, is going to influence your understanding of the world and also influence the things you buy, right? And also the things that you are able to buy as well. Certain goods in certain countries are easier to get than others, and these are tied to politics as much as they are tied to economics. So in anthropology, really, we also find it hard to disentangle politics from economics. This has sprung up with an entire theoretical paradigm called political economy. And then there are offshoots of that concerning the political economy of health, which we'll get into in the medical anthropology part of this class as well. But basically, political economics at its very basis basically just says you can't separate politics and economics. They are tied together, and one will influence the other. So when you're talking about, let's say, oh, the COVID-19 is not really impacting the stock market in the US. Well, that's the stock market. What's actually happening on the ground? There's record rates of unemployment, as an example. People are getting furloughed. So is the economy really doing well? And that kind of ties into the critique of people talking about the stock market, is that the stock market really doesn't reflect the economy. It reflects a certain aspect of the economy, yes, but it is not the economy. So economic anthropology really encompasses the production, exchange, consumption, meaning, of course, is a very useful part of anthropology, and use of both material objects and immaterial services. Basically, this just says anthropology likes to insert itself on certain topics related to economics. And that primarily deals with the meaning making we put behind objects. Why do I want to buy this thing? Is it a cultural product? Is this something that my ethnicity, for instance, likes to make when they are cooking, as an example? And then why is that the case? Where did that history develop from? And how is that sort of cultural practice sort of interfacing with the larger economic system and also other cultures as well? So you can think about this again in terms of, like, for instance, creolizing food and creating new food products over time, which is also a new cultural product at the same time. And then sort of tying in the assumptions of an economic anthropologist, again, broadly, and not everyone thinks the same way. People are not rational actors. They do not always know what they want. That makes a lot of sense, right? When you walk into, let's say, Target, as an example, you may be overwhelmed with the amount of products that you have there. And you may have walked in there wanting to buy, let's say, soap, and you end up walking out with a new dress, a bunch of food, etc. I don't need to probably explain to you how Target works. That's sort of what happens there. And then additionally, people do not interact with the market robotically. I like certain products, yes, but I'm not always going to buy them on routine on a daily basis, as an example. I may decide, hey, today is feeling like a pizza day, and then I'll go buy a pizza. But I'm not going to buy pizza every single day, probably. And then additionally, culture plays the primary role in wants, but economic inequalities, again, the focus of this class in particular, also shape access to services and goods. There are certain products that are saying, this is a part of my culture, yes. But you may, for instance, only buy certain foods, let's say, on a holiday. As an example, one of the primary reasons that turkey became sort of the staple for Thanksgiving, beyond the sort of historical ethos we put behind it, was that turkeys were readily available, essentially. And because of that, they became a part of the sort of staple tradition of Thanksgiving, as an example. But also there was a status symbol behind it as well. For instance, I'm not a big fan of turkey, but it's what you eat at Thanksgiving for the most part in the US. So I grin and bear it, essentially. So that's sort of where culture can play into economic discussions as well, because again, you can't disentangle history from these topics either at the same time. And in terms of economics, there could be a lot of things that you want to buy, but you simply can't afford, or you can't justify that you can buy this product because it's too expensive. This could result in, for instance, you buying a lot of fast food products because you can afford to pay for more expensive groceries that are better for your overall health, which can shape your health over time as well, and can lead to obesity, risk for developing hypertension, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, etc. So you also must think about health in terms of political economics, which again is that framework that I mentioned on the previous portion of this presentation. Really, economic anthropology has been there since the inception of the discipline. And that is because anthropology has always engaged with economics. In fact, the discipline was born out of colonial Britain trying to find ways to better subjugate indigenous peoples in the Americas. Essentially, they wanted their goods and labor. It's interesting I'm talking about this on Indigenous Peoples Day / Christopher Columbus Day, because this often was tied together as well. Anthropology, during this colonial pursuit of the so-called New World, was subjugating the individuals in these certain countries. However, they found that in some cases it was easier to, for instance, colonize a country if you were able to make them essentially more inclined to accepting that colonialism process. And one way of doing that was to embed anthropologists there, basically as they're called handmaidens to colonialism, basically to facilitate this process. They would go to, let's say, tribes out in the Amazon and say, all right, we want your, let's say, sugar cane. We want your gold, and we will trade you certain products that we developed over in Europe. And oftentimes these trades were unequal in terms of the economics of it, but the indigenous individuals that didn't have a lot of experience with the sort of economic system and also didn't have a lot of power to say yes or no really to this topic ended up getting very raw deals over time. And this also applies, of course, to the United States as well. and the US expansion, the so-called manifest destiny over time too. But anthropology has for a long time had this sort of shadow of colonialism overlooming on top of them. And it is really hard to get out of that because the discipline itself is very much rooted in that colonial endeavor. Think about my work in Belize. I am a white American male going to a so-called exotic tourist island in Belize doing research on individuals there. That itself is rooted in colonialism, and so is the idea of, let's say, the lone individual going to an exotic location and learning the customs of the natives. If you put it in that light, and that's what the history of anthropology often did, it looks very bad, and for very good reason, because there's a lot of very rightful critique towards that earlier anthropology. So a lot of anthropology today is very reflexive on our colonial history and tries to find ways to alleviate that role or find ways to critique the ongoing process of colonialism today. The so-called neo-colonialism, where really we're not entering borders anymore with standing armies, we're colonizing through economic policies and practices, such as unfair trade deals that put countries in very skewed loans that they have to pay back over time, that kind of makes them beholden to certain more powerful countries. That itself is colonial. It's just a new form of colonization, essentially. It's economic, it's cultural. It's not so much physical, essentially. However, most economic anthropologists today would probably trace their own roots to Karl Marx. We tend to hold a critical perspective, and Karl Marx is basically the, if you want to put it in these terms, the grandfather, as well as Engels, of critical critique and perspectives also too. So Marxist thought. Marx and Marxism, and also by association, communism, are still very much today kind of dirty words when they are mentioned, especially in politics. Again, can't tie discussions of economics without talking about politics. However, in the earlier periods of the US, for instance, some individuals were very much punished for, say, prescribing to Marxist thought, including anthropologists. This was the so-called Red Scare, for instance. So Marx argued that humans are inherently materialist. We see the world in terms of our production and the objects or goods that we produce. A materialist perspective basically says that culture is going to be shaped by the objects that we have on a daily basis. So for instance, if I go to the school and sit down at a desk, that desk is itself an object that I notice it at. The school itself is an object with underlying meanings. This is a school, this is where I learn, as an example. And the way that I view objects and interact with them is going to shape how I think about my role in this larger system also too. Now, to a critical Marxist scholar, the elite control the population by controlling our production and the goods we produce. Taking again the example of the school, who owns the school? The government, if it's a public educational system, right? And that, for the most part, shows you the sort of hegemonic authority that we give to the school system. Not saying you shouldn't get educated. In fact, you very much should get educated. But think about who is giving you the education and what sort of agendas they may have when they are educating you a certain way about a certain topic. Again, bringing up colonialism, because again, when I'm recording this, it is Indigenous Peoples Day. There has been a long history of sort of erasure of the indigenous experience and massacres they experienced over time, and still the underlying disparities they face today. We talk about Thanksgiving as this time of cooperation of Native Americans and colonizers or pilgrims, as was more politely called, I would say. And as they came over here, they had a nice dinner, and then there was a cooperation. The Native Americans taught us how to make corn and grow corn and maize, that kind of thing. That really largely is a bunch of statements that are all half-truths in themselves. And the history is a lot more bloody and a lot more messy. That basically goes hand in hand with colonialism. But that's not how we're taught. Also, for instance, in the South, oftentimes slavery is kind of glossed over or barely even mentioned in curriculum. Again, thinking about who is teaching you certain things and what kind of agendas they may have or biases they may have that are shaping the way that you're getting your education. This also, for instance, might apply to Karl Marx in terms of, let's say, religion. Karl Marx believed that religions as an institution sort of served to keep individuals in a certain country basically in line. There's been a lot of work on religion as a means basically of population control. And not, of course, this is not agreed upon by every anthropologist, but there's a lot of work on how basically doing the same things over and over again and being told to do things a certain way over and over again kind of starts to shape the way you think about the world also too. And that basically is what critical Marxism is trying to say, is that these underlying power differentials, there's the bourgeoisie, basically those in authority, and the proletariat, those that are like the working class as an example. That power structure shapes inequalities. And power and economics go hand in hand because those that have power often also have the economic potential to be able to enact change at the also political level too. So again, Karl Marx is very influential in critical thought, and many anthropologists today, without even meaning to do this, oftentimes don't identify themselves as Marxist scholars, despite pulling from critical thought, largely due to this history of individuals getting sometimes incarcerated or blacklisted because they prescribe to our Marxist ideals. So there was decades of time where anthropologists were basically talking about Marxism, just not calling it Marxism, because they felt that they were literally in danger physically, but also in terms of their jobs and their well-being also too. So it is important that we understand these roots so that we can build upon them and also clear the air from a lot of misconceptions about, let's say, Marxist thought as an example. So watch this short YouTube video. It sort of goes over what I'm about to talk about, but just in more detail and also more fun, I think. So many anthropologists were accused of being communists because of their research into Marxist thought. This was the Red Scare period, about in the 1950s or so, where to be communist basically was a very, very bad label to be put on yourself. And because of that, anthropologists started to disassociate themselves from Marxism, but still did research using similar theories, as I mentioned before. Today, it is generally more acceptable to identify as a Marxist, and actually we have a Marxist professor in our department, at least in scholarship. But in society today, saying you're a Marxist usually is met with some raised eyebrows or some furrowed eyebrows in some senses. So again, there's feminism, and then there's feminist scholarship, just the same as there is Marxism and also Marxist scholarship. They're related to each other, but not exactly the same. And understanding those differences is important when you're trying to have a discussion or even a debate also too. I mention this because we're talking about anthropology and economics, and this is really how it's been shaped over time, given our colonial history and also this sort of Marxist history that's kind of underpinning a lot of what we talk about today. So here is that term I keep throwing around. Political economy, an approach in anthropology that investigates the historical evolution of economic relationships as well as the contemporary political processes and social structures that contribute to differences in income and wealth. Again, long definition because that's by necessity broad, because anthropology largely argues that you can't really separate policy and politics from economics and culture. They all influence each other. They all compound to influence each other. And you can't really separate one from the other because they're so intertangled with each other. This is an important concept to understand when you're looking at, let's say, sexual transmitted diseases in a certain context. You can talk about, oh, men are participating in risky behavior and beliefs by not wearing a condom. Why are they not wearing condoms in general? Can they afford condoms? Do they justify not wearing a condom because they think that it makes them less of a man, so that ties to culture? There are different aspects to really look at on a certain issue, and you can't just say this is what a certain culture is doing. You must ask, if you're doing good anthropology, why is that the case? And that largely is the role of so-called critical perspectives, is getting at the why, which is what anthropology stresses is probably the most important thing about understanding culture. Why do people do certain things? That's at the end of the day, the underlying research question that every anthropologist is asking, because that is really the important question. That's where you get that good quality data. So talking about the larger macro systems is great, but again, anthropology also likes to look downstream, as it's called, at the local level. How do people sort of navigate this political, economic, cultural environment? This is agency, which is again the ability to act independently within your environment, which is influenced by social, cultural, and political economic structures. I'm using multiple terms now in one definition, so this is why it's important to keep up with the material, because this is an iterative process. I'm sort of scaffolding you guys to get to the point where you feel comfortable understanding these interlocking theories and how they sort of play into each other also too. Agency, again, you can kind of think of the Western conception of free will, which also is a critique of it too, because it is largely a Western conception. You are the sole individual walking around and interacting with a larger system, right? However, that becomes difficult to do when a lot of different environmental constraints are presenting themselves to you. Let's say, for instance, you want to try and receive an abortion as a woman. Does your country allow you to have an abortion? Is it by the state level? Let's say you live in Texas, but you can only get an abortion, let's say, in Wyoming. You're having to drive to Wyoming to get an abortion. I picked a random state, so don't read too much into that. But the underlying constraints here are both structural in terms of, okay, can I actually get the service here? And if so, or if not, where can I get it at? Then cultural constraints, for instance, stigma related to having an abortion. Do I feel like I will be stigmatized if I am showing that I'm visibly pregnant and then get an abortion, as an example? And tying this to, for instance, to Belize, what ends up happening is the abortion law there is so restrictive that if you receive an illegal abortion, you can get thrown into prison for the rest of your life as a woman, as well as the doctor that administered the abortion procedure. So if you are visibly pregnant and you're going in to get maternal care, but then later on you decide that you don't want to carry this fetus to term, your doctor knows that you are pregnant. Then when you go in again, he may question, why aren't you pregnant anymore? Again, you can get in very much legal trouble for that. So what ends up happening is, from my experience and from my research on the topic, that a lot of women don't go into the doctors to get maternal care because they are concerned that, what if I want to have an abortion later? Or something happens to the fetus and then I am blamed for having an abortion, which can lead to maternal and child complications, because we now have women not going in to get necessary services, which can increase their risk for a variety of different complications if they're not being monitored. So anthropologists often critique economics for getting rid of human agency. If humans were rational actors, they would always make predictable decisions. For instance, if women saw that it is very difficult or illegal to get an abortion, from a rational actor perspective, they probably won't have the abortion. However, what we have found all over the globe is that when you restrict abortion legally, it's going to happen regardless. It's just going to happen clandestinely or illegally, which increases the risk for maternal complications and maternal morbidity and mortality, because they can't be administered in a safe and legal setting because of the laws in place that prevent women from being able to get an abortion. But the irrational thing in that sense would be to get an abortion illegally. However, for these women, this is not an irrational behavior. It is very much rational for them, given the economic and cultural constraints of them and their ability, for instance, to take care of a child. Agency is constrained by an individual's social and physical environment. Keep that in mind. So we can describe people as having more agency than they actually possess, and this has been used to blame them for their behavior. Again, using the abortion example, women have the agency to find an illegal means to have an abortion. However, if they are caught or if someone accuses them, that can have both social and also legal repercussions. So, to give an example that I often use for agency, if I am standing on one side of the street and I know it's illegal to cross the street, and I know there's a lot of traffic there, the only thing stopping me from crossing the street is that law and my understanding that I might be in physical danger if I cross the street. There's nothing literally stopping me from crossing the street. I can walk across it if I want to. I'm just risking the dangers of either getting arrested or getting hit by a car. I still have the capacity in terms of my personal agency to try to walk across the street. This is especially apparent when public health and policymakers say the poor are being irresponsible. There's a lot of different uh, understandings of what that term means in public health, but basically what a public health person is trying to say when they're saying someone's being irresponsible is that they are practicing risky behaviors. And a risky behavior is basically something that says this might be a risk factor for something. If people are not wearing condoms, this is a risky behavior in sex because they might get an STI or they might get pregnant or get someone else pregnant. However, again, you must look at the cultural and economic context in that area. And do people have the capacity to make rational decisions, so-called, based on their positionality and their economic potentials and, for instance, their gender power relations in their environment? For instance, if a woman is in a relationship with their husband, but their husband has a lot more power than she has, like in Belize is often the case, she may have limited capacity to, for instance, practice condom negotiation or to make her partner utilize a condom. So from a public health metrics perspective, if she gets an STI or gets pregnant, they could say, oh, she was being irresponsible because she was not utilizing contraceptives. However, when you look at the actual local context, the reason she couldn't use contraceptives is because her husband would not want to consent to using a condom, as an example. So again, very messy topic, and it can get into very dangerous and very sordid health issues, which is why it's important to understand that context so we do not make the wrong interventional decisions, or we do not blame people for their own poor health, given the circumstances that they have to interact with and operate within. So this kind of brings us back to structural violence, which again I defined as the institutions and policies that impact social, mental, and biological health. You can think about this again in terms of abortion access in the country, because it has been argued that limiting abortion access itself is a form of structural violence. Also, too, let's say that the majority of women that are unable to access an abortion legally are women of color, because let's say wealthier white women are able to find the service legally, let's say in a state that provides abortions more readily. This could also be a form of structural racism also too, unequally shaping who is able to get certain services over another, with implications for health and wellness also too. So structural violence itself is a component of a sort of critical perspective or paradigm, which also ties to Marxism too, and Marxist thought and theory. So structural violence builds off of Marxist materialist thought and political economy. If people cannot afford or access goods or services, they will have worse health. I mean, that makes sense, right? If you are unable to have a good insurance plan, you may be less inclined to go to the doctors because you may have a very expensive medical bill at the end, shaping your ability to get, let's say, the care that you need, let's say to manage your type 2 diabetes or your high blood pressure as examples. And this is tied to state policies, economic or otherwise, which shape our potentials as biological citizens. Again, the state has some capacity to sort of dictate and control our physical bodies. They can throw us in jail if we break a law. They can shape abortion policy to make it really difficult to access. They have the power and authority to do that, which we give them through this hegemonic process of accepting the authority figures above us, essentially. And policies and economics then can be seen as shaping our ability and our agency to make, let's say, quote unquote, rational decisions. So when you hear language about this group of people are doing risky behavior, so they're acting irresponsible, think about the larger system that they're having to operate within. And then what that system is going to look like on the ground when you actually look at the local cultural specificities of that context also too. Again, difficult topic and also very depressing topic. Anthropology, for the most part, can sort of fall into this comfortable space for us of critique and talking about disparities and health outcomes that unequally favor certain groups over the others. But that really is what happens on a daily basis on a variety of different topics. If there is unequal health, it often is tied to economics, it's often tied to politics, it's often tied to race and ethnicity in this country. And also in other countries too, but they might just look very differently concerning the different histories and racial demographics of those countries also too. So again, I'm not trying to depress anybody, but this is sort of the work that anthropology often does. There's been calls to do what's called the anthropology of the good, which basically is looking at the good stuff also too, but We can't just ignore the bad stuff in favor of the good stuff either. And this also sort of ties into what happens later on in this semester, in this class, where we talk about applied work. This is identifying a problem and saying, okay, these are very real disparities. How can we start to address these and to make it more equitable so that everyone has a fair chance to, let's say, have good quality access to food services that can promote their own health and wellness, as an example. Again, hard to do, and even me just saying equal could be something that never really is attainable either. But we must try to find ways to better the society that we live in if we are trying to, let's say, promote overall well-being as a member of this country, as an example, too. This may sound a little complicated, so let's kind of dive into an example that may help you sort of conceptualize agency and being able to make choices in a larger system. And what also may constrain your ability to make those choices also too. So consider a typical college student. Is this student happy with the courses her department or college is offering? Are there courses that she needs to graduate that are not being offered yet? So for instance, when you are, let's say, making your course schedule for spring, you may consult the course catalog and say, oh, that's a really cool class. But when you go to sign up for the class, you see it's not actually being taught in spring. No professors have been assigned to that class. So in that sense, your agency to take what you want is limited. Or let's say you're an anthropology major, but you want to take some psychology classes. You may be encouraged to take just anthropology courses because you're going to need to graduate at a certain amount of time, let's say, to fulfill your Bright Future Scholarship, as an example. So in that sense also too, you're having to make a decision that you may not want to make just based on your economic potential also too. But additionally, basically this overall system and structure, we all have to operate and interact with it based on policies that are developed at way above our heads, let's say at administrational levels. So let's take this class, for instance, 4401. The reason a lot of professors that are teaching this class are PhD students is because they needed a lot of professors to teach this class. This became a new capstone requirement that every student needs for the most part. So they realized at the top level that they needed a lot of professors. Well, they recruited PhD students to teach this class to sort of fill in that gap. So that is a way for them, for instance, to rationalize, okay, we can recruit PhD students who make a lot less than a tenured professor, as an example, to teach the same class. You can also see this in terms of what's called an adjunct professor, which basically is a professor for hire that almost works as like an agent or a freelancer more than anything. And they get paid a lot less than, let's say, a tenured professor. A lot of colleges are starting to move towards having a lot of adjunct professors because there's a lot less job security for those professors, and they have to pay them a lot less also too. They get paid on a per class basis essentially. And oftentimes professors are having to teach upwards of 5 to 6 classes just to basically make it above poverty level. And sometimes they may even have to teach at multiple universities also too. I'm cushioned by that because I have guaranteed funding as a PhD student here in this department, but not everyone gets that funding too. So there's again a lot of economic barriers that also administration is thinking about in terms of what school is going to look like, as an example. This also can be applied larger scale, let's say like at the policy level in the United States, as an example too. Politicians are often making decisions that are based on economics. Okay, how much money could we spend to do this thing? How much money could we save by doing this thing, as an example? I can tie this again back to the school example as well. So this student, let's say she wants to take Intro to Psychology. She chooses that as one of her classes. Great, fantastic. However, she may have to now choose different electives, and those electives to be what she wants to take, right? But they also are constrained by, let's say, the main anthropology electives. So again, she has the agency to choose what she wants, but at the end of the day, she's being strongly encouraged at the administrative level, but also at the economic inducement level to take certain classes, right? So that's going to shape her ability to take what she wants in that sense. This depends on factors outside of her control. Who is able to teach that class, or let's say if they don't want to justify, in terms of administration, having this many 4401 classes, there may be less opportunities for people to take this class, so they may have to wait a semester, for instance, if it fills up too quickly. So there's a lot of different sort of interplay that happens there in terms of administration. And I can basically give an entire class lecture on the interworkings of the USF apparatus in terms of how all these parts fit together, but I would bore you because that sounds boring to me as well. But also it is very interesting how these parts all fit together. And we interact in this larger system as basically cogs in this larger wheel of USF also too. So here's my favorite man again, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher slash historian and scholar. Biopower is also intimately tied into discussions of politics and economics. Because again, remember, it's the state, it's the United States government, as an example, that is able to and wants to control its citizens' biology. There is a reason that a lot of individuals are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. Think about, for instance, who is being incarcerated for nonviolent crimes? Oftentimes, black males, or black females also too. Additionally, prison as a private system is heavily incentivized to keep the system operating, of course, to meet their bottom line also too. Additionally, prison labor is a huge source of basically free labor for the US, and getting rid of that is not something that a lot of people are very willing to do, despite them saying differently if they are challenged, as an example. So looking at prison labor as an example, watch this video and sort of think about this again in terms of even Marxism, in terms of the ability for the individual, the proletariat, again, the working class individual or the person in prison for this example, to be able to exercise their own agency, right? They're being controlled. Their bodies are literally being controlled to do certain things because they're in this prison system, right? And that is going to shape what kind of work they produce because they're being told what kind of work they can produce as well. So again, this is a very real example of how you can't separate biopower from economics and politics because they're all interwoven into each other. And Michel Foucault actually wrote an entire very, very dense book on this topic, as well as sort of the origins of sexuality, which ties into reproductive labor in this country as well. I've mentioned this before, but labor itself, of course, connotates work, and that even applies to reproduction. Who controls reproduction in the US? Again, politicians, to a large extent, at least in terms of the policy and laws that are in place. And then we must look at, on the ground, how is this experienced by families? How is this experienced by women? Now, add an additional component to this of race. Whose labor is valued over another? Again, value also ties into economics, of course. Literally, the terminology does. But also, at the social level, who is valued over someone else? Think about that in the US, for instance, and I'm sure you can draw your own conclusions about what that answer is. So watch these two videos and think about them again in terms of work, labor, economics, culture, and history in the US very broadly. Again, we're getting to the point in this class where all these terms and all these different ways of thinking are sort of colliding into each other, and that's intentional. This is very messy, and it's impossible to disentangle these different factors from each other, despite certain disciplines, such as economics, trying to say you can just talk about economics without talking about politics or culture, as an example. That's my anthropological perspective, of course, biasing the way that I view the world, but that also is what the science really is saying. We're looking at the local level and the experiences, both lived and historical, of those that are having to interact with and operate within this larger system with their constrained agency, as an example also too. So this may seem like a slight tangent, and it is slightly a slight tangent, but bear with me. So I mentioned biopower, I mentioned literally the labor of reproduction also too. And I want to tie this into a body of research from actually my previous advisor at the University of Central Florida, and her work in Poland on abortion access in the country, and also the lowered fertility rate in the country too. So Poland has the lowest recorded abortion rate in Europe. Think about that. Poland is a very Catholic country, for one, so that could itself explain there being a low fertility rate, but also, or abortion rate for that matter, but also there are plenty of other countries that are largely Catholic as well. Why is Poland in particular having a low abortion rate? We'll get to that. The church is a big factor, of course, but the church and the government are tied together to a very large extent in Poland. Politicians largely are influenced by what the local bishops say, what the Pope says. And that can lead to this pronatalism discourse in the country, which is basically the government is trying to encourage women to have multiple children. For example, again, tying it to economics, the government tries to give women stipends if they have multiple children. Basically, if you have X amount of children, you'll be paid X amount of money per month. Sounds like a great deal, right? But a lot of women are not even doing this. And then when questioned why, it's because women are starting to realize, well, they've realized for some time, but now they are actually starting to see the fruits of this. That, for instance, it is more cost effective for them, using economic term, to just go to work and have less children than it is to, for instance, have to stay at home and take care of children while, let's say, their partner goes out and has a job for their own selves. Also, it increases their mobility, social and also economic, to have more freely, or to be able to freely move around the country without having to worry about children, as an example. So despite all of this, the TFR, or total fertility rate, meaning the number of children who are born per 1,000 women during their so-called childbearing years, is declining rapidly in the country. So on the one hand, there's limited abortions, but on the other hand, there also is limited amount of babies being born. So that may seem like a contradiction, but what is happening is that women are just choosing not to get pregnant because they see the economic benefit of not doing so, and also the social benefit of not getting pregnant either. Not to say there are not social benefits of getting pregnant too, but this is basically women that are, like we were seeing in the 1950s in the US, starting to see what it means to really have a more liberated understanding of their own bodies and their role in society. They're not just stay-at-home mothers. They are able to go out and get a job, as an example. And this extra mobility leads to a very different sort of cultural understanding. But also, really interestingly, what this book says is that during the socialist period in Poland, women had a lot of mobility and social and economic growth than they did previously, or even in terms of the more capitalist framework they have today. That is because socialism, generally in policy, kind of sees women and men as more or less equal, right? So women were able to go get higher education. Before, this was just the purview of men. They were able to get jobs. Well, before, this was just the purview of men. And after the sort of communist bloc fell and socialism sort of collapsed in Poland, and they had a more capitalist sort of framework or model, a lot of women realized that they actually started to lose a lot of power in the country. And this is sort of on their minds too when they're thinking about, let's say, the church or the government encouraging them to have extra children, when before they had easier access to contraceptives and abortion services in this socialist framework. So again, you can't separate history from this either, because it's tied to politics, it's tied to economics, it's tied to culture. And this may be experienced differently and interpreted differently on the ground by, let's say, the women that are having to navigate this system. This basically breaks down what I'm kind of trying to get at here. So you can kind of think about this in terms of the social, political, and economic. The social, or really the cultural, shift in Poland from women being the primary or only caregivers for children. The Catholic Church ostracizes abortion providers, doctors, so many abortions are done and not reported, lowering the overall number of cases considerably also too. So there may actually be a lot of abortions happening in Poland, but no one is reporting these abortions because they're happening clandestinely. So really no one really knows. And the government really isn't questioning this because it makes them look, in their mind, better in terms of them being a Catholic country with a low abortion rate also too. In terms of politics, Poland shifted from a state socialism perspective, again giving women more or less equal status to men, to a Western capitalist model which limited their newfound social freedoms. So before, they had the ability to, for instance, go get a college education, they were able to get a high-paying job, they were able to get abortion services more or less easier than ever before. And then all that was walked back when socialism fell and capitalism sort of took favor in the country, which is also tied to, of course, economics. So women perceive the cost of raising a child to be too expensive, considering it can slow or halt careers and education, which makes sense, of course. And women are also becoming disillusioned with the promises of capitalism and the role of the church in their lives, and feel that the stipend is paternalistic and does not do enough to cover the cost of raising children. Paternalism basically is a way of thinking that says men are essentially in charge, or that those above can make decisions on you because they know more than you. You can think about this in terms of like a paternity, basically parents. The government oftentimes acts as a sort of parent over you, and you are the children in this example. And they're saying, okay, you need to do this thing because we tell you to, essentially. And women are getting, frankly, tired of being told what to do with their own bodies. So it makes a lot of sense that they are resisting these policies and these mandates and these encouragements at the governmental level, and also the religious level, based on this history, based on the disparities they faced over time, and where they see themselves today also too. Finally, I would like you to go to this link and sort of play around with it for a bit. Basically, it's a pseudo game that also is trying to sort of give you an understanding of how expensive it is really to be poor. And that's a phrase that anthropology sometimes says as well, where basically it means, like, for instance, okay, fast food certainly is cheaper than buying groceries. However, if you buy fast food every day, it may end up being more costly because you, for instance, can't save meals, or you can't meal prep, as an example. Additionally, if you eat a bunch of fast food, you may be more at risk for obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, which then forces you to go to the doctor, which would then be more costly than getting groceries. However, if you can't afford to pay for groceries on a daily basis, you may have to make those decisions on a daily sort of understanding of, okay, well, I can't afford groceries, so I'm going to get McDonald's today, that kind of thing. And over time, that adds up, and it is very punishing on your body and as well as your wallet, essentially, also too, to do this every day. So go through this exercise. Really, it ends when you run out of money, and that's sort of like the end lesson out of it, is that it'll happen eventually. But you have to make some really tough decisions sometimes. Sometimes it's for fun in the exercise, and sometimes it's very serious issues. But just think about this and sort of think about it in terms of how you can't separate policies, economics, culture, gender in some cases, and also your race also too. Because all of these factors shape who you are and your life course over time, and what kind of options you have available to you as well. So have fun with it. I used to do this in person with my students, and they seem to love it. We actually spent most of the class period doing this. So I hope you like it, and yeah, have a nice rest of your week also too. That being said, just remember that the documentary paper is due soon, as well as quiz 2 being due, I'm going to get at the end of the week next week. But just know that you are going to have both the paper and the quiz more or less within the same week of each other. So keep that in mind as well. Good luck. And I'm going to actually give you a little extra time on the quiz, just because why not, really? So be prepared, but just know that that's also a factor.